Not every family celebration feels like love. Sometimes it feels like a ranking. I'm Taran, 27, standing in a room dressed up for my brother Thomas's promotion, watching my father lift his glass with a pride that sounds warm until it turns sharp. He praises Thomas for being everything a family could want, then adds, almost casually, that not everyone measures up. The room laughs when Thomas looks at me and pushes it further. I don't flinch. I just say calmly, "Give me 30 minutes. Back when we still lived under the same roof, nothing in our house was loud enough to call unfair." That's the strange part. There were no screaming matches, no slammed doors, no dramatic declarations that one child mattered more than the other. It was quieter than that. Thomas was never officially named the favorite. No one would have said it out loud, but somehow every important decision curved gently in his direction, like gravity had already chosen him. If we planned dinner, it was what he liked. If we planned vacations, it was around his schedule. If something needed to be celebrated, his milestones arrived first, louder, brighter. And my mind felt like footnotes. I noticed it early, long before I had the words to explain it. When conversations turned serious, Thomas's voice carried weight. People paused when he spoke. They adjusted. When I spoke, there was often a polite nod, sometimes a distracted smile, and the discussion continued as if my contribution had been a warm-up act before the main point arrived. No one told me to be smaller. That's what made it effective. Mom believed peace was the highest form of success inside a home. She moved through tension like someone smoothing wrinkles from fabric. If Thomas interrupted me, she would redirect gently. Let him finish, even if I had been the one speaking first. If something felt unfair, she would lower her voice, offer a soft explanation, and suggest that maybe it wasn't worth making into a bigger issue. Bigger issues were dangerous. Discomfort in our house was treated like a stain that needed to be wiped away immediately. Not examined, not understood, just erased. And usually the easiest way to erase discomfort was to expect the quieter person to absorb it. That was me. Dad valued calm too, but his version of calm was different. It wasn't about smoothing, it was about avoiding. He hated conflict the way some people hate loud alarms. Anything that disrupted the atmosphere was an inconvenience. If something felt uneven, he didn't address it directly. He let it settle into the walls, into routine, into habit. And habits become rules. I learned quickly that pushing back didn't change the outcome. It only changed the temperature in the room. And whenever the temperature rose, all eyes shifted toward me, not in accusation exactly, but in expectation. Be reasonable, be understanding, be the bigger person. It wasn't said, it was implied, so I adjusted. When decisions were being made, I stopped offering opinions unless someone asked me directly. And even then, I softened them. I wrapped my thoughts in disclaimers. It's just an idea. It doesn't really matter, whatever works best. Over time, I became skilled at reading the air, the subtle tightening of Dad's jaw when something might turn into a disagreement, the faint shift in Mom's tone when she sensed tension building, the way Thomas leaned back in his chair when he knew the outcome already favored him. Participation requires space. I was never trained to take space. I was trained to measure it. The strange thing is, it didn't feel cruel in a dramatic way. There were no obvious villains. There were family dinners, there were holidays, there were smiles in photographs. On the surface, everything looked balanced, but underneath, there was a quiet structure. Thomas stood at the center of it. I orbited. When something had to be chosen, schools, extracurriculars, schedules, the conversation often began with him. How would this affect Thomas? What would Thomas prefer? Could Thomas manage this? By the time my turn came, the shape of the decision was already formed. My input felt like an afterthought attached to a completed blueprint. I remember noticing how often I nodded. Not because I agreed, but because a disagreement felt heavier than compliance. If I disagreed, Mom would tense slightly, trying to keep things smooth. Dad would grow quiet, waiting for the disturbance to pass. Thomas would look mildly irritated, as if I were delaying something more important. So I stopped. Silence became easier. At first, it felt like self-control. Then it became instinct. Eventually, it became identity. I became the one who listened, the one who adapted, the one who understood without being told. If something shifted in the house, I felt it immediately. If someone was in a mood, I adjusted before it spilled over. I could predict outcomes before conversations even began. There's a strange power in observation, but it's a lonely one. I didn't explode. I didn't rebel. I didn't demand fairness at the dinner table. I shrank quietly, piece by piece, until my absence from certain conversations felt normal to everyone, including me. That's how roles are formed. Not through announcements, through repetition. Thomas grew into confidence easily. He expected to be heard because he always had been. When he entered a room, he carried the certainty that his thoughts would matter. I entered rooms calculating how much of myself would be acceptable that day. Mom praised my maturity. She would say I was easy. She said it with pride. I think she believed it was a compliment. Dad appreciated that I didn't cause trouble, that I understood, that I didn't challenge him in ways that forced uncomfortable conversations. Understanding became my currency. The tension in our home never shattered anything. It stretched instead, thin, persistent, invisible to outsiders. It wrapped around daily life so tightly that I didn't realize how little air I was breathing until much later. I stopped expecting inclusion. I started expecting distance. But correcting the narrative would have. Meant creating friction, and friction was the one thing everyone feared more than inaccuracy. So I let the stories stand. You can disappear slowly without ever leaving the room. Looking back, I don't think anyone sat down and decided I would become the quiet one. It happened gradually through 1,000 small adjustments, through smiles that lasted a second too long, through topics redirected, through praise given unevenly but consistently enough to form a pattern. By the time I was old enough to question it, the pattern felt permanent. And maybe the hardest part wasn't that Thomas was prioritized. It was that I became complicit in my own shrinking. I told myself it was easier, kinder, smarter. Peace is easier to maintain when one person absorbs the imbalance. I just didn't realize how much I was absorbing. That role, the observer, the adapter, the one who cools the room instead of warming it, that didn't arrive overnight. It formed quietly over years, until one day I looked around and realized that I knew exactly where I was allowed to stand. Not at the center, not at the edge either, somewhere in between, close enough to belong, distant enough to disappear. A few weeks before the promotion party, something shifted in my life, but not in a way anyone else could see. Nothing dramatic happened. No arguments. No sudden discoveries that exploded in public. On the surface, everything stayed intact. But underneath a quiet truth began separating what I had always believed from what was actually real. It started the night Jordan came over. Jordan and I had been friends long enough to understand boundaries without spelling them out. We never mixed personal loyalty with professional risk. He worked close to systems that occasionally brushed against corporate records, never directly in them, never in ways that crossed lines. We respected that line. We protected it. But that night felt different the moment he walked in. He didn't bring his usual energy. No jokes, no casual updates about work. He carried a kind of calm that settles into a room before words do. The air shifted. I remember thinking before he even spoke that something heavy had already arrived. We sat side by side on the couch for a while without saying anything. Not in fear, not in shock, just in understanding. There are silences that feel empty, and there are silences that feel like the last second before something irreversible is placed in front of you. This was the second kind. When Jordan finally spoke, he didn't dramatize it. He didn't frame it as scandal. He explained it like someone walking through a structure, carefully pointing to beams and foundations. Internal financial records connected to the company where Thomas worked had surfaced during a routine system process. It wasn't designed to expose full details, just controlled summaries. But something had slipped through, not enough to look like chaos, enough to look like a pattern. At first, I didn't fully understand what I was seeing. There were reports, clean, polished versions that investors and partners saw, growth charts, stability metrics, confident forecasts, the kind of presentation that builds trust quickly. Then, there were the internal layers beneath them, losses that had been carefully reclassified, revenue gaps adjusted and redistributed into categories that softened their impact. Timelines shifted just enough to create the appearance of consistent upward movement. Projects labeled as strategic expansions when internally they were attempts to patch strain. It wasn't sloppy. That's what made it unsettling. Nothing about the structure looked accidental. It was deliberate, clean, designed to hold under scrutiny from anyone who didn't look too closely. Jordan showed me how certain quarters that should have reflected decline were presented as transition phases, how underperforming segments were folded into broader metrics, so the weakness disappeared inside stronger numbers, how private notes inside internal files acknowledged risks that never appeared in external communications. The illusion wasn't loud, it was polished, and polish creates confidence. I remember staring at the screen, trying to force my thoughts into something emotional: anger, outrage, betrayal. But what I felt instead was his confusion. Not about the numbers, about Thomas. This was the brother everyone described as disciplined, consistent, reliable, the embodiment of success. Jordan didn't rush me. He moved backward through the timeline, showing me that this wasn't a single pressured decision made during a difficult quarter. The pattern stretched across years, adjustments layered carefully on top of older adjustments, each one small enough to defend individually, together impossible to ignore. "This isn't panic," he said quietly. "This is structure." That word stayed with me. Structure means repetition. Structure means protection. Structure means other people knew. Silence, I realized, wasn't passive inside systems like this. It was collaborative. It was maintained by everyone who benefited from the surface remaining smooth. And then Jordan showed me something that shifted everything from uneasy to undeniable. The project that brought Thomas his recent recognition, the one everyone was celebrating as proof of his leadership, didn't begin in his hands. The foundation came from someone else. A colleague working beside him had built the original framework. Early drafts carried a different name more prominently. Initial concepts, structural logic, preliminary data models. They trace back to someone who had never been mentioned publicly. At first, it looked like collaboration, shared documents, joint discussions, nothing unusual. But over time, subtle changes appeared. Language and presentation files adjusted. Ownership phrasing shifted from "we developed" to "Thomas led." Internal credit lines softened. Meeting summaries highlighted his contributions more frequently. The other name appeared less and less, not removed in a single act, but diluted gradually. No confrontation, no open conflict, just erosion. By the time the project reached executive visibility, Thomas's name was positioned at the center. The original architect had become a supporting figure, then background, then barely visible. I asked Jordan if it was possible that the colleague agreed, that maybe this was mutual. Jordan didn't answer immediately. He just pulled up a sequence of timestamps, draft revisions, comment histories, minor corrections where one name replaced another in headings. It wasn't theft in a cinematic sense. It was quieter. It was absorption. And in that moment, something inside me cooled. I didn't feel rage the way I expected to. I didn't feel explosive betrayal. What formed instead was clarity, steady, almost clinical. The kind of clarity that doesn't shout, it settles. All those years of watching Thomas receive admiration. All those family conversations about his leadership, his reliability, his drive. I had always assumed the difference between us was temperament. That he stepped forward and I stepped back. That he claimed space and I hesitated. But this wasn't about temperament. This was about manipulation disguised as competence. Jordan reached for my hand once. Not to guide me, not to tell me what to do, just acknowledgement. Then he let go. He made it clear he wouldn't carry this further. He wouldn't interfere. He had shown me what existed. What I chose to do with it or not do was mine. After he left, I didn't cry. I didn't pace. I sat in stillness and let the confusion rearrange itself into something sharper. For years, I had accepted the narrative that Thomas earned every spotlight, that my smaller role was simply a reflection of difference and ambition. I had internalized the idea that I was quieter because I was less capable. But the documents told a different story. They told me that success in his world was curated, that discipline sometimes meant controlling perception, that confidence could be built on structures designed to hide instability. And something else became clear too. The family dynamic suddenly made more sense. Thomas had always moved through rooms with certainty. That certainty didn't just come from internal belief, it came from reinforcement. From systems both at home and at work that bent toward him. At home, silence protected him. At work, silence protected the illusion. I realized then that my lifelong role as observer had given me something unexpected. I knew how to read patterns. I knew how to notice what wasn't being said. I knew how to watch structures form over time. And this structure was undeniable. Confusion faded completely. In its place, there was something colder. Not cruelty, not revenge. Clarity. I understood that confronting him immediately would protect him. A private argument could be dismissed, denied, reframed as jealousy. Silence for once didn't feel like weakness. It felt strategic. For the first time in my life, I wasn't shrinking to keep peace. I was holding still to see the full shape of the truth. And once you see the full shape of something, you can't unsee it. I didn't know exactly what I would do yet, but I knew this: the version of Thomas my family celebrated was built on layers no one else had examined closely enough, and I had just examined them. After that night with Jordan, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't call Thomas. I didn't storm into my parents' house demanding explanations. I chose silence. But this time, it wasn't the silence I had grown up with, the kind that wrapped around my throat and kept me small. This one felt different, intentional, measured. Speaking too early would have protected the wrong people. It would have exposed what I knew before I understood how to use it. So I said nothing. And in that nothing, something shifted. I started watching more closely, not in a paranoid way, not obsessively, just carefully. I paid attention to Thomas's language when he talked about work, the way he described his project, the pauses, the confidence, the subtle pride that bordered on performance. I noticed how easily he repeated the same polished phrases, like lines rehearsed long enough to feel natural. At family dinners, I listened instead of withdrawing. There's a difference. Before, my silence had been about survival, blending and cooling the room, disappearing. Now my silence had weight. It had purpose. I began collecting details, small inconsistencies, timelines that didn't quite align, the way certain topics were redirected quickly, the names that were never mentioned. I didn't challenge anything. I didn't correct anyone. I just stored it all. Silence stopped feeling like something done to me. It became something I shaped. When Thomas spoke about recognition from executives, I watched his posture more than his words. When my parents praised his discipline, I noticed how easily admiration formed around results without asking about process. No one questioned the surface. No one wanted to, and I understood why. The illusion was comfortable. It kept everything aligned with the version of reality they preferred. Challenging it would have required admitting they hadn't seen clearly, that they hadn't asked deeper questions, that they had chosen pride over scrutiny. So I didn't challenge it. I let the structure stand. On the outside, nothing about me changed. I answered texts. I showed up when invited. I smiled when expected. If anyone sensed distance, they mistook it for maturity or indifference. Inside, I was building something steady. I observed timing. I paid attention to who attended certain events, who valued reputation most, who depended on image. I learned how information moved in Thomas's world, who listened, who repeated, who amplified. And I waited. For the first time in my life, I wasn't absorbing imbalance. I was studying it. There was a quiet power in knowing more than I revealed. In walking into rooms where everyone assumed I was still the quiet one, unaware, unimportant. They didn't realize silence had changed sides. It no longer meant I had nothing to say. It meant I was choosing when to say it. Weeks passed without visible tension. Thomas continued rising. Invitations expanded. Conversations revolved around his success. My parents' pride grew more confident, more public. And then the invitation arrived, the promotion party in San Diego. Polished, celebratory, designed to reflect everything they believed had been earned. I accepted without hesitation, because by then my silence was no longer survival. It was preparation. San Diego looked perfect that night. The venue glowed with soft lighting that made everything feel expensive and intentional. Crystal glasses caught the light and scattered it across polished wooden tables. The air carried the scent of perfume and freshly served food. Conversations floated gently, controlled and polite, each one carefully shaped to sound impressive without sounding desperate. It was a room designed to celebrate success. Thomas moved through it easily. People reached for his shoulder, his hand, his attention. Standing near him seemed to make others feel brighter somehow, like proximity alone carried value. He smiled in that measured way of his confident, composed, completely at home in admiration. Mom stood near the center of the room, posture, straight expression, steady. Pride rested on her face, like something she had rehearsed and perfected. Dad stood beside her, a glass in his hand, scanning the crowd with quiet satisfaction. Then someone gently tapped a glass. The sound was soft, but it sliced through the conversations immediately. The room adjusted. Voices lowered. Faces turned toward the center. Dad stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. It traveled cleanly across the ballroom. "We're so proud of Thomas," he began, steady and sure, not like someone who always fails. The words settled in the room like a thin layer of frost. Mom nodded beside him, her smile unchanged, her eyes unwavering, as if what had just been said was obvious, natural, deserved. For a second, no one reacted. Then, a few people chuckled. Not loudly. Just enough to signal they understood the direction of the comment. Thomas didn't move right away. The corner of his mouth lifted. Slightly. Not warm, not surprised. Controlled. He turned his head slowly toward me. In that moment, it felt like the room narrowed, like the lights dimmed everywhere except the space between us. He spoke clearly without raising his voice. "Is that person you?" The laughter came instantly, not awkward, not hesitant. It was relaxed, careless, the kind of laughter that assumes cruelty is entertainment. Crystal glasses tilted, shoulders shook. Somewhere across the room, a stray clap echoed as if the moment deserved applause. And then from another corner, someone added loudly, "Maybe she should finally prove she's not just a shadow." A shadow. The word drifted through the air and stayed there. I could feel eyes shifting toward me, not avoiding, not sympathetic. Curious, waiting, watching to see how I would fold. Thomas leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice, not because he was afraid to be heard, but because he wanted the words to land sharper. "You won't do anything," he said quietly. "You never do." For years that sentence would have been true. I kept my gaze steady. I didn't look at the floor. I didn't glance at my parents. I didn't swallow the moment the way I had swallowed so many others. Silence had trained me well, but this silence was different. I answered calmly, clearly, without rushing. "In 30 minutes, you'll know the answer." No explanation, no raised tone, no visible emotion. The room didn't know how to process that. The laughter thinned, replaced by low murmurs. People looked between us, trying to decide whether this was still entertainment or something else. Thomas smiled again, but it wasn't as effortless as before. I didn't stay to see what expression came next. I turned and walked away, past tables that were still untouched, past wine glasses that hadn't reached anyone's lips, past conversations that hesitated as I passed, then resumed in quieter tones. No one stopped me. No one reached for my arm. No one asked what I meant. They were too comfortable where they stood. Outside, the night air felt colder, cleaner, real in a way the ballroom hadn't been. The sounds of the city hummed softly in the distance. My heels clicked against the pavement, steady and unhurried. For the first time that evening, I could hear my own breathing without it being measured against anyone else's expectations. When I reached my car, I sat inside without turning the engine on. The silence wrapped around me, not heavy, not suffocating, just present. 20 minutes earlier, I had been standing under chandeliers, reduced to a shadow in front of strangers. Now I was alone, hands resting on the steering wheel, the faint warmth of the engine lingering beneath the hood. And something inside me was shifting. Memories didn't return in order. They arrived in flashes. A dinner table where my voice dissolved before finishing a sentence. A living room where laughter belonged to someone else. Compliments that were never meant for me. Phone calls that were never made. Years of shrinking, years of nodding, years of absorbing imbalance so everyone else could stay comfortable. My hands didn't shake. My breathing stayed even. But inside, something old was cracking under its own weight. This wasn't anger building in my chest. It wasn't revenge forming like a spark. It was awareness. Nothing would change if I didn't change. If I stayed quiet the way they expected, the cycle would continue. If I kept adjusting, I would keep disappearing. If I waited for respect, I would grow old waiting. The word shadow echoed in my mind. A shadow only exists when someone else blocks the light. I leaned back against the seat and closed my eyes for a moment. Not to escape, but to gather. Whatever happened next wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be dramatic, but it would be different. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't sitting in silence because I had no choice. I was sitting there because I was about to use it. I stayed in the car longer than I expected to. The engine was still warm beneath the hood, the city noise muted by thick glass. My hands rested on the steering wheel, steady, not trembling, not clenched, just there. Inside, though, something had shifted permanently. My thoughts weren't racing in straight lines. They came in fragments. Dinner tables, unfinished sentences, years of adjusting myself to fit a space that was never shaped for me. But underneath all of it, there was no chaos. There was clarity. This wasn't anger. Anger burns fast and loud. What I felt was controlled, measured, like something that had been forming quietly for years and had finally reached its final shape. Nothing would change if I didn't act. I reached for my phone before I allowed doubt to interrupt the movement. My fingers didn't hesitate. I scrolled once and pressed call. Claire answered on the second ring. Her voice was calm, grounded, the kind of presence that never filled silence with panic. She didn't rush into concern. She didn't ask what happened at the party. She just listened. For a second, I could hear my own breathing through the speaker. It surprised me how even it sounded. Claire didn't offer comfort. She didn't soften her tone. Instead, she asked one question placed exactly where it needed to be. Have you really thought this through? It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't judgmental. It was precise, and in that moment, I understood that my answer didn't require explanation. It didn't need a story. It didn't need emotion wrapped around it. Yes, one word, steady, firm. No hesitation. There was a brief pause on the line, not doubt, just recognition. Claire heard it, the weight behind it, the finality. She didn't argue. She didn't warn me. She didn't ask for details. Understood, she said quietly. The call ended without drawn-out goodbyes. I lowered the phone and leaned back against the seat, closing my eyes for a single breath. Not from exhaustion, from acknowledgement. The version of me that survived by shrinking had just stepped aside. Whatever moved next was already in motion, and this time it wouldn't be reversible. The next morning, I was alone when Lena's name lit up my screen. For a second, I just stared at it. She didn't start with hello, no small talk, no questions. She went straight into it, typing like she was still inside the room, like the air hadn't fully settled yet. She said that a few minutes after I walked out, the ballroom tried to reset itself. People returned to their drinks. Conversations resumed in careful tones. The laughter came back thinner this time, but present. It felt like everyone had silently agreed to treat my exit as a minor disturbance. Then the screen behind the stage flickered. At first, no one panicked. Lena wrote that some guests assumed it was a technical glitch, the kind that happens in venues, juggling tight schedules and elaborate setups. The screen went black for a few seconds. Staff glanced toward the control area, then it lit up again. But instead of photos or a celebratory slideshow, rows of numbers filled the screen. Clean, aligned, impossible to mistake. Columns stretched across the entire display. Revenue projections, internal loss adjustments, dates, percentages, private notes that were never meant for public eyes. There was no dramatic headline, no explanation, just data precise and undeniable. Lena said the room went quiet in a way she had never heard before. Not polite quiet, not expectant quiet. Stunned. Mom reacted first. Her voice cut through the silence, sharp and strained. She kept asking what was happening, demanding someone turn it off. Her eyes moved frantically from the screen to the staff, as if searching for a person who could reverse what had already been seen. Lena wrote that Mom grabbed Dad's arm tightly, like physical contact might stop the numbers from existing. Dad didn't move. He stood there completely still. His face lost its usual composure. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He didn't shout. He didn't step forward. He just stared at the screen as if he understood instantly that control had slipped out of the room the moment those numbers appeared. Thomas tried to recover it. Lena said he moved quickly between tables, nodding apologies out of instinct, like someone trying to contain a spill before it spread. His expression was no longer composed. It shifted too fast, confusion, irritation, calculation. Then he turned toward the side exit. He walked fast, not running, but close. He pulled one of the doors open and stopped. Hotel staff rushed toward him at the same time. Calm voices, controlled gestures. But tension was obvious. Lena said they began locking down exits, trying to prevent chaos, trying to stop guests from flooding out or escalating the scene. The atmosphere changed in seconds. Guests weren't whispering anymore. They leaned toward each other and started speaking openly. Some read parts of the data out loud. Is that a reclassification? Those numbers don't match the public reports. Look at the dates. Phones came out. Some people took pictures of the screen. Others recorded video. A few just stood there frozen, staring at the columns like they were trying to convince themselves they were misreading them. Staff attempted to redirect attention. They said it was a technical failure, a system error. They moved quickly toward the controls. But Lena wrote something that stayed with me. It didn't matter how fast they moved. The information had already been seen. The pattern had already been recognized. Faces in the room had already changed. Thomas stopped trying to leave and turned back toward the center, but the room didn't look at him the same way anymore. The admiration had drained out of it. In its place was scrutiny. Mom's voice had lowered by then. No longer sharp, just strained. Dad still hadn't spoken. Lena said the music never came back on. The cake remained untouched. Glasses stayed half full on tables that no one returned to comfortably. Conversations didn't recover their earlier tone. Even the lighting felt different, as if the glow had dimmed. The celebration didn't end loudly. It just collapsed. Her messages slowed toward the end as if she was choosing her words more carefully now. She said the party never recovered. No one laughed again after that moment. People left in clusters, not making eye contact, not offering congratulations. Then she sent one final line. "You were not there, but everything you said became real." The week after, the exposure unfolded without spectacle. By Monday morning, the company issued a brief internal memo acknowledging questions raised regarding financial reporting procedures. The language was careful, neutral, and deliberately narrow. But within hours, an independent audit firm was retained to conduct a full review of the company's books over the past 5 fiscal years. By Tuesday, Thomas had been placed on administrative leave. The notice cited the need for unrestricted cooperation during the investigation. His access to company systems was suspended. His corporate email account was disabled. The promotion announcement that had been prepared for public release was quietly withdrawn. Auditors arrived midweek. They occupied a conference room on the executive floor. Laptops opened, document requests piling up in methodical spreadsheets. Senior accountants were interviewed one by one. Archived emails were restored. Classification histories were traced line by line. The restructured losses, the internal transfers, the deferred liabilities, everything that had once seemed like clever strategy was now examined as potential misconduct. Outside counsel joined by Thursday. Legal teams reviewed board minutes, compensation packages, and disclosure statements. They prepared for possible regulatory scrutiny. Insurance carriers were notified. The board convened an emergency session excluding Thomas. Within the office, the shift was immediate and unmistakable. Executives who had once aligned themselves with Thomas began speaking in careful, distanced language. I wasn't aware. That decision was made above my level. We relied on the numbers provided. Influence that had taken years to build dissolved in days. At home, the changes were quieter, but no less visible. Mom's social calendar thinned first. Luncheon invitations were postponed. A charity gala she had chaired for 3 consecutive years announced a rotating leadership model. Text messages went unanswered longer than usual. Calls ended quickly. Friends who had once praised Thomas's brilliance now spoke cautiously, asking neutral questions about the situation without offering reassurance. Some avoided the topic entirely. Dad's business relationships showed strain by the end of the week. Two long-standing partners requested formal clarification regarding their exposure to the company's financial reporting. A joint venture meeting was rescheduled indefinitely. A private investor asked for documentation that had never previously been questioned. The erosion was subtle but steady. There were no dramatic arguments in public view, no raised voices in boardrooms. Just the measured procedural unraveling that follows when confidence collapses. Thomas made no public statement. His legal counsel advised silence. He was seen once leaving the office building late at night, escorted by security. The image circulated briefly among employees before being deleted from internal messaging threads. Inside the house, conversations were shorter. Doors closed more often. The television volume remained low. No one mentioned the ballroom. No one mentioned the screen. But everyone understood that something fundamental had shifted. By Friday, the investigation had moved from preliminary review to formal inquiry. And Thomas, once celebrated, once untouchable, was no longer in control of the narrative. The calls began the next morning. First from Mom, 3 in a row, spaced 5 minutes apart. No voicemail the first time. The second carried a thin, careful tone. The third was quieter, almost rehearsed. "Taran, we need to talk," Dad texted instead. "Call me when you can." Then, an hour later, "This has gone too far." Thomas waited until midnight. His name lit up her screen again and again, each attempt longer than the last. When she didn't answer, he sent a message that was neither apology nor accusation. "You've made your point. Pick up." She did not. Days passed. The messages shifted from controlled to uncertain. Mom's tone softened. Dad's grew restrained. Thomas's became sparse. None of them acknowledged the specifics. They asked for clarity, for conversation, for family. Taran gave them silence. Not the old silence, the one shaped by fear, by dismissal, by being talked over. This one was deliberate. 6 months later, she changed her number. She removed shared access to accounts. She updated legal permissions. The boundaries were clean, documented, and final. Distance brought something unexpected: peace. There was no triumph in it, no bitterness, just the steady quiet of a life no longer monitored, no longer explained. She became unreachable, not to punish, but to protect. And in that distance, she learned the simplest truth of all. Walking away is not losing. Sometimes it is the first act of choosing yourself and safeguarding your peace. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. For many people, moments like these aren't dramatic. They're quiet, complicated, and very real. If any part of this felt familiar, you're not alone. I'd love to hear your thoughts or experiences in the comments. And if stories like this resonate with you, consider subscribing so we can keep exploring them together.